Hello and welcome to today's McKnight's webinar. You've tuned into Level Up PDPM Accuracy with Fresh Insights. Today we'll be talking about reimbursement tools and strategies that can help providers collect appropriate payment for the services they're providing. I'm McKnight's Senior Editor Kim Marcellus, and I'll be moderating this event. I'll introduce our expert speaker in just a moment, but first we have some housekeeping to take care of. If you have any audio problems during today's presentation, please first check the volume control on your device. Sound should be coming from your computer speakers. You can also use the help button if your troubleshooting doesn't work. We will have time for a Q&A session near the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, please go ahead and submit them starting right now in the panel on the left side of your screen. Finally, today's slides are available for download or printing. To find those, go to the handouts box, which is also on the left side of your screen. And now let's meet today's presenter. Wendy Strain is Director of Consulting Services for Polaris Group. Wendy has over 25 years of healthcare experience, ranging from acute care to the long-term care setting. In her current role, she is responsible for the development, implementation, and management of clinical and regulatory programs. Okay, Wendy, it's your turn. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Kim, for that great introduction. I appreciate you guys at McKnight's giving Polaris Group the opportunity to speak today on this very important topic. So our agenda, we will be discussing 5 actual missed opportunities we saw during recent PDPM audits. We'll talk about how to monitor your PDPM accuracy. We will also talk about 6 changes in the draft version of the MDS slated to be implemented next October. For those of you in leadership, we'll talk about strategies for the PDPM and MDS accuracy for your facility. I like to know my audience, so quickly I'd like for you just to respond to the poll question and answer, what is your position in the facility? So while we're waiting, I'll just tell you quickly that I manage Polaris Group's outsourced MDS program. And let me tell you some stories about that. We've gone into facilities recently that were 6 months behind on their assessments. Some 80 behind on assessments. Some of these facilities had an MDS nurse that was consistently being pulled to the cart. I know it's tough out there, and again, it's back to the fire of the day. So if you have an MDS coordinator sitting in an office and you have someone that calls in, typically one of the things you'll see is that MDS coordinator being pulled to the floor. What happens? You get behind. So that's kind of the state of our industry right now. I see we've got a lot of MDS coordinators. That's good. I hope that you'll gain some knowledge today. A few administrators, just a couple for directors of nursing, some regional staff, and some others. Great. I appreciate you doing that. I like to know who I'm talking to. So you can see the results there. 66 MDS coordinators, 16 administrators. We've got 47 corporate regional staff and 4 directors of nursing. A good mix. Thank you all for joining. So, where are we right now? 2019, PDPM was released. It rolled out in October of that year. Facilities spent most of 2019 preparing. We were going from the RUGS model to a PDPM model, which of course would represent that therapy no longer drove reimbursement, and it was based on multiple characteristics of the resident. So we all prepared for that. We were ready for 2020 to be a time to learn more. 2020, what happened? I don't need to revisit with you, but there's that saying, the best laid plans. COVID derailed most good intentions related to mastering PDPM. For most facilities, reimbursement took a back seat and everyone went into survival mode. So here we are now in 2022. You are seeing an increase in state surveys. They're back in buildings in full force. We had the additional surveyor guidance that was released during the summer that was related to the rules of participation, phase 3, which impacted 60 plus F tags. Lots of work involved for facilities over the summer getting ready for that. We had the final rule released. It was only 385 pages to wade through, so lots of information there for us to digest as an industry. And then just when we were getting comfortable again, maybe a little bit, there came the draft version of the MDS 3.0 version 1.1811, which will be released next year. And by all accounts, it appears that draft version will be very close to what is going to be released as the final version. So there we are with all of that on our plate, and your MDS coordinators continuing to struggle. And with any audit that we do, we see problems. And some of these, as I talk about our examples, as I go through the slide presentation today, you may say, boy, that's basic. We should have gotten that right in the beginning. You're right. We should have gotten it right in the beginning. But as you'll see, we continue to see the same errors made time and time again. Why is that? Well, I think there's multiple reasons. I think 2020 and the fact that we were all dealing with COVID during that time certainly impacted the ability to get to a point where we really understood PDPM. However, one of the things that continues to plague our industry is staffing. So the MDS coordinator role, how valuable are they to your facility? Pretty darn valuable. They drive your reimbursement. So what happens when you can't fill that position? Perhaps you pull somebody from the floor. Maybe they've done an excellent job out there taking care of residents, and you think, well, maybe they'll make a good MDS nurse. MDS nurses are not made, they're grown. Do we give them the proper orientation? Do we mentor them? Do we spend time with oversight, teaching them as they make errors, and those errors are identified, how to not continue to make that error time and time again? Not sure that's happening. So as I wanted to learn more about MDS coordinators and how they were doing out there in facilities as we rolled out an outsourced remote MDS program a while back, I joined a Facebook page, which is actually kind of like a support group. MDS coordinators post questions and then the group answers those questions. So I have two examples here. Trust me, there is no stupid question. There is no question that doesn't deserve to be asked. However, these questions are just two examples, and I could have pulled at least 100 more of questions that were asked that were so basic. It tells me one of two things. One of these MDS coordinators says, I'm pretty new here. So she admits that she's new to MDS. Her question is, what happens if you submit a late MDS? She should have learned that the first day of orientation, yet she's reaching out to a group on this Facebook page to ask that question. The other question is from someone who says she's having a blonde moment. We all know what that means. So maybe she knew the answer to this. She just couldn't think of it this particular day. Maybe she had worked 3 night shifts that week because she was pulled to the cart to cover for a call-in. Not sure why she was having a blonde moment, but her question is PDPM for all residents or just Med A? So again, something that she should have learned in the beginning when she was going through orientation. Kind of telling of where we are in this industry today and our problems, the source of the problems. Quality care requires financial resources. Period. End of story. You cannot have quality care if you're not financially healthy as a facility. Today, I hope to help you to see that supporting, educating, and providing oversight of your MDS coordinator is key to financial success. Just a brief look at this slide. You're not alone if you're having problems. Every facility has room for improvement. This is kind of a high-level overview of the MDS process. You can see in the middle here, we have PDPM errors equals revenue loss, or on the flip side, overpayment. You may get to have that revenue reimbursement, but it doesn't matter if it gets taken away from you once your claim is reviewed. You also put yourself at risk for F-tag citations. So just a quick overview, your admission process, if something's broken there, you're not getting the proper ICD-10 coding, you don't get the right documentation from the hospital, your process is broken right from the beginning. One of the first things we'll talk about today with missed opportunities is lack of knowledge in setting the ARD appropriately. You've got the GG documentation process. We're going to also talk about that as a missed opportunity for correct coding and how that impacted the facility's reimbursement. We're going to look at incomplete documentation of the frontline staff. Resident-focused interviews, they must be completed within the ARD. If they're not, they do not count. You cannot code them. You'll end up dash filling those items, especially the BIMs. And then the lack of the MDS coding knowledge of the MDS coordinator, key. You're going to hear the word education a lot today, so kind of get used to it. Key is education, oversight, and support of your MDS coordinator and your team. So we didn't have a lot of administrators in the beginning. It was right early into the presentation, so more may have joined now. But I have another poll question for you. Have you experienced MDS coordinator turnover in the past year? You can answer this if you are an MDS coordinator and you've turned over in the last year, since we didn't have a lot of administrators, it appears. So while we're waiting on this, I just want to be transparent in the fact that today's presentation does not consist of a comprehensive overview of PDPM or MDS. It would take me a full day just to skim the surface and talk about PDPM, not to mention MDS as a whole. I'd have to have about 3 days to do a great job of educating someone on the MDS process as a whole. So also, I don't have a silver bullet or any kind of hack that's going to ensure that you get proper reimbursement. My motto has always been, when it comes to PDPM, get paid for the care you provide. My goal today is to help you see that without proper education, mentoring, support, and oversight, the MDS coordinator will very rarely be successful. I'll show you some examples of where facilities left money on the table, and hopefully in seeing this, you'll implement some processes to prevent this from happening in your facility. We've got quite a few responses, and it is as I thought. We had 97 yeses, that's 53%, and no, there were 85, which is 46%. So more than half of you have experienced MDS coordinator turnover in the last year. And you know what? If you find a good MDS coordinator, I'm speaking to leadership here, you find an MDS coordinator, you invest in them, you make sure that you are providing the training, and then you lose them. Kind of stinks, doesn't it? It's part of what we're dealing with the staffing issues, though, most definitely is impacting MDS coordinators. So our first missed opportunity we're going to discuss today is setting the correct assessment reference day for IV fluids. You may be saying, well, gosh, that is so basic. Why do we need to talk about that? However, as I said in the beginning, we continue to do PDPM audits where we're literally finding that this very easy fix, this very simple issue is being missed. So just to recap, for those of you MDS coordinators that are new or those in leadership that don't understand this, you set the ARD according to what's the best ARD to capture the document, capture IV fluids. So number one, if you're in a leadership position, think about this. Ask your team, or you may already know the answer, what day do we set our ARDs? If you hear the answer day 7 or day 8, you have a problem, because many of our residents that come from the hospital will be eligible to receive the extra reimbursement based on receiving IV fluids in the hospital. Number one, we've got to review the documentation. Make sure you're getting a complete packet from the hospital. We're going to determine if the fluids were given for nutrition or hydration. If so, and they were given so that we can set the ARD back to capture those, the ARD, the look back period for this item is 7 days. So we move the ARD forward so that we can capture this. If so, then we code it in Section K, and you see a snapshot of what Section K looks like there. So our example today is from an audit that was done with one of our MDS clients. We have a resident that was admitted for pneumonia. They had a 3-day hospital stay. The resident received IV fluids on day 1 and day 2. The ARD was set for day 7, and the CMG for nursing was captured as a clinical complex due to oxygen. The hospital discharge indicated that IV fluids were given for hydration and poor PO intake. So setting the ARD on day 5 would have captured that. Had the facility set the ARD earlier in the stay and captured those IV fluids, it would have been almost $50.99 per day. So very significant. What can you do? What's the solution? Back to the question, if you're in leadership or if you're in MDS, ask yourself, why are we consistently setting the ARD for day 7 or 8? You're missing this opportunity. Make sure you're getting a complete packet from the hospital and that it includes MARS. Your first step is determine if an IV was given. Second step, was it given for nutrition or hydration? And then follow the REI guidelines for the coding of Section K. So communicating with your whoever is doing Section K, if it's not the MDS nurse, you should be guiding this process, though, and then making sure that it is coded if it's your RD or your dietary manager that's coding Section K. Our second missed opportunity is based on Section GG coding documentation. So Section GG became a thing for us in this industry. Back in 2016, it rolled out in October, of course. So we've been dealing with Section GG coding for 2,194 days, and yet we still can't get it right. Section GG impacts both the PT/OT CMG and the nursing CMG, so it's very important to both. One of the things that we see missing in some of our audits is there's no collaboration between nursing and therapy evident in the documentation. So nursing and therapy need to communicate. Sometimes nursing's 3-day documentation related to GG function items is different than therapy. There needs to be collaboration. So setting a process where you're discussing that in your meetings is very important. Documentation in the record has to support the final coding of this section. Your MDS coordinator, and this is key, must understand the coding directions of Section GG in order to code accurately. You'll see this in our example from one of our audits. And I will add that a lot of providers are seeing ADRs based on managed care companies disputing that Section GG coding was supported in the record. So for this missed opportunity error in coding from our case study, a resident was admitted with Parkinson's disease after they had a fall with a fracture. So the primary reason for admission for this resident was the fracture. There was bed mobility and transfers coded by the MDS coordinator as substantial maximal. However, when we look into the record, we saw that PT and nursing documentation and the care plan indicated that for Bed mobility and transfers, the resident required two-person assist. So for this particular resident, those two items should have bumped up to dependent as far as the coding on the MDS for section GG items, bed mobility and transfers. This is often missed. It's forgotten about. It's one of those little things that we see missed often. So for this facility, if we had that accurate coding, it would have resulted in almost $30 extra per day for that resident, $29.42. It did not impact the nursing, the OT, PT, OT, CMG, but it did change the nursing, and that's where your extra reimbursement came from. What can you do? I'm going to use that word again, educate, educate, educate. Make sure your team understands. Make sure that the MDS coordinator understands the coding directions in section GG. We're going to talk a little bit later about the upcoming changes suspected that are identified in the draft version of the new MDS for next year. Section G is gone. Everything's going to be based on section GG. So this is a good time to dig in and provide the education so that section G is coded accurately. Nursing and therapy, as I said, should collaborate, and the record should support the coding of section GG. Our next missed opportunity is related to PT, OT, CMG. So as you know, the coding in section I0020B must be accurate, and it will determine where we fall as far as clinical category. We have 4 choices for clinical category, and those are dependent on what's coded in section I0020B. Our situation here that we identified during a Polaris MDS audit was that the facility lost $15 per day because ICD-10 was not coded accurately. So this is a resident that had a fracture, and when they were in the hospital, the decision was made to do a partial joint replacement to repair that fracture. The MDS nurse coded appropriately in section J that the resident experienced a partial hip replacement. However, she chose a code. She chose S72.91XD, which did not map to the major joint category. The correct code for this resident should have been S72.002D, which was more specific and does map to the major joint clinical category. For this error, it cost the facility $14.43 per day. ICD-10 coding must, the MDS coordinator must understand the diagnosis coding. It's a very difficult thing to throw somebody into a position that includes diagnosis coding and understanding ICD-10, and then expecting them to learn the RAI manual, learn how to code, and still run the MDS process for the facility. ICD-10 coding is important in every one of our components, but here we see that an inaccurate code in I0020B resulted in that error. So making sure that you provide the education for your MDS coordinator on ICD-10 coding, diagnosis coding, and then provide the oversight to make sure that ongoing she or he gets the support that they need. Ask your MDS coordinator, or if you are an MDS coordinator on the call, do you use your CMS mapping tool? And then do you use the tools embedded in your EMR that might have shown you that that particular code that the MDS coordinator chose did not map to the major joint category? So using that CMS mapping tool to educate yourself and ongoing to make sure that your choices for I0020B go into the right, get you into the right clinical category. So back to our example, the nurse knew there was a partial joint replacement because she checkboxed that in section J, yet she did not realize that her code that she chose was not specific enough to get her into that clinical category. And then, as I said, education, oversight, and support. One way that you can provide the ongoing oversight is routine MDS assessment audits for accuracy. Remember that ICD-10 impacts not both, but all of the CMGs, PTOT, SLP, nursing, and NTA. So it's very important that you provide that education for your MDS coordinator. Our next missed opportunity is with SLP, speech language pathology component. So there's a lot. I could spend a couple of hours just going through how you get into a certain SLP CMG and the coding directions to make sure that you get accurate reimbursement. But just as a quick overview, your SLP coding for the 5-day MDS, just a reminder, is paid at 100% throughout the length of the stay. Some of the things that calculate into this as far as coding on the MDS that puts you into a specific CMG is your acute neuro condition back to I0020B. What's coded there will either be acute neuro or non-neuro. Then you have, again, back to ICD-10 diagnosis coding, you have the comorbidities. And then you also have cognitive impairment that is generated from either a BIMS interview by social services or a staff assessment related to cognitive impairment. Mechanically altered diet and swallowing disorder are two of the other issues that calculate into this. And when you look at all of the things I've just mentioned, you can understand that CMS put a lot of thought into this, because for each one of these comorbidities, conditions, you see that the resident has an even greater need for speech language pathology, ST services. So keeping that in mind as we look at our examples. So back to where we see the SLP comorbidities, just a couple of tips for you. Back to I0020B, making sure you choose the appropriate diagnosis there. I will tell you that there are times that you're going to have a choice to make, that perhaps the resident has two diagnoses that are active, two things that were treated in the hospital, and you can choose. They're both kind of sort of equal in weight. And for those two, you can look at them and determine which is going to provide more reimbursement for the facility, get paid for the care you provide. So, for example, it could be a fracture that occurred when the resident fell while having a stroke. I will tell you, this may be a good tip you can take. If you have a situation where you have two diagnoses such as that, overall, the acute neuro, if you can justify using a code in I0020B that really does reflect the reason for skilled services, and you choose that acute neuro code, your overall reimbursement will be better. Now, I caution you, just because the resident has an active diagnosis that is, part of your decision making, if it doesn't really have anything to do with why they were in the hospital, please don't use it. That's a good way to get your money taken back. You may get the money on the front end. So just be very cautious there. Don't go mining for an acute neuro diagnosis that's really not supported in your record as being the primary reason for admission. Another key, making sure that your cognitive impairment is captured. Do you not deserve additional payment for those residents that have cognitive issues? Of course you do. So make sure you get paid for that, making sure that the BIMS interview or the staff assessment is done within the ARD window. We do see that problem sometimes. A couple of other things to think about. The swallowing disorders we sometimes see are missed, and something I want I want to bring to your attention. It may not be something we can find in a chart audit, but just as you walk through your facility, think about the nurse at the med cart that's prompting the resident on swallowing techniques because the resident is having difficulty swallowing medicines. The CNA at mealtime that's reminding the resident to take smaller bites and encouraging drinking between bites. That sometimes does not get documented because that's an old situation, an old issue with the resident, and perhaps speech therapy is not working with them because that is an pre-existing problem and they're at their maximum potential and they're not going to improve in that area. So make sure that your staff is aware that even if the resident coughs, it shows any signs and symptoms of difficulty swallowing, even once during the ARD look back, make sure that they document that. And then mechanically altered diets, we don't often see that missed, but it can be missed, especially if ST is conducting trial feedings while the resident is NPO on the nursing unit. Also, another little tip, if you have a mechanically altered diet or swallowing disorder that arises during the stay, make sure you consider an IPA. For our opportunity here to discuss a actual result from a Polaris Group audit, there was a swallowing issue missed on the MDS, which resulted in a $12 per day loss for reimbursement. So the resident was admitted after a stroke. The diet was set to puree during the hospital stay. That was the order once the resident returned to the facility. The resident was admitted with speech therapy orders, and the CDM coded Section K after only reviewing the nursing and dietary documentation. She did not have access to the speech therapist's documentation and did not pick up on the fact that the resident was experiencing coughing during the trials of the mechanical soft diet. That cost the facility $12.06 per day. What can you do to make sure that these errors are not happening? As I said, there are so many things involved in the speech language pathology component. We could talk about this for a couple of hours, but just a quick overview of some things you can do. Back to education. Remember those comorbidities I discussed. So making sure your MDS coordinator understands ICD-10 diagnosis coding related to the comorbidities in the SLP component. Ensure your team recognizes the need to document swallowing difficulties, even if it occurs only once during the ARD look back. And then that collaboration between nursing, dietary, and the speech therapist to make sure that nothing is being missed as far as swallowing problems and mechanical soft diet. Okay, next missed opportunity is our NTA component. So I have a screenshot here from our quick reference guide that I'm going to be providing to you all after the presentation. And this kind of gives you a good overview of the scoring methodology as far as points and how that correlates to an NTA case mix group. So some things to think about when we discuss NTAs is there are multiple different patient characteristics that are used to determine the NTA CMG. Remember, this is the component that pays at triple the rate for the first 3 days of the stay. So it is very important that that 5-day MDS be coded so that you capture all of the NTA points that are possible. Recognizing the care provided, multiple comorbidities calculated into the NTA score. There are over 2,100 ICD-10 diagnosis codes just when coded in Section I 8000 can impact the CMG here with additional NTA points. So for our example, this particular resident we reviewed during a PDPM audit had a wound that was obviously infected. There was an antibiotic ordered. The MD had written a progress note which indicates there was an infection of the wound. Wound infection was not marked in Section I 2500. Therefore, the existing, based on other coding of the MDS, there was 1 NTA point achieved. Had the MDS coordinator coded the wound infection in section I, the CMG would have changed with an additional 2 points. So it would have went from 1 point to 3 points. That would have changed from there's a typo there. Sorry about that. An NE to an ND, which indicates a total loss for the facility as far as revenue for $35.36 per day. So pretty significant. Just a checkbox, just the knowledge of knowing that I need to look to see if that wound is infected, and then I need to go to section I and check wound infection. Cost the facility $35.36 per day for this resident's reimbursement. So what can you do? So with NTAs, I'm going to say it again, ICD-10 coding, diagnosis coding, and understanding of proper diagnosis coding is key. So education and ongoing oversight and support of your MDS coordinator or whomever's doing the coding in your building. For some facilities, there is an actual certified coder. That's rare though. Most of the time it falls to the MDS coordinator. Remembering that section H, section K, section M, and O also contain items that impact NTAs. Getting the correct NTA CMG is heavily reliant on ICD-10 coding. You just can't have accurate PDPM reimbursement without accurate ICD-10 coding. So I've given you several examples here of ways in which coding errors have impacted facilities. We have here one example. So just to kind of walk you, especially those of you in leadership, I want to bring to your attention that the example of IV fluids, while not a resident, we said that that cost $29.72 per day. If you have 75 residents, and for a smaller facility, this may be a little bit of a stretch, but for larger facilities, I absolutely think you probably have 75 or more residents who this applies to. So back to our first example, we had a resident that IV fluids should have been captured or could have been captured if we had set the ARD earlier in the stay. So we're going to look at the money. We're going to extrapolate that over the course of a year for 75 hypothetical residents with a 20-day stay. $29.72 multiplied by 75 times a 20-day stay for each of those 75 residents, $44,580. That's huge. I'm going to take just a second and let that sink in. That is only one example. If we look back through our slide, and we did that for each of the examples that we gave today, and we looked at the hypothetical number of residents in your facility over the course of a year that had that issue, there was an inaccuracy, a missed opportunity, you can see that we're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now I'm going to go back to what I've talked about multiple times throughout this presentation already. Education, mentoring, support, and ongoing oversight is how you can avoid losing hundreds of thousands of dollars that you cannot afford to lose. How to monitor your PDPM accuracy. One way, especially for you MDS nurses, that I'm going to try to help with you being able to better monitor your PDPM accuracy and just learn more. I'm going to provide you with a quick reference. We'll send that out next week after we get the list. So, upcoming changes for the October 2023. Again, this is one of those things that it would take me at least a couple of hours to talk about in detail. So I just picked a couple of a few things that I feel like we can talk about today that'll be helpful to you. So number one, how to get ready. We've got to look at the draft version and understand that more than likely that draft version or a very similar version is going to be the final. So learning now what the new draft version has as far as changes and looking at your policies and procedures and making sure that what you have in place now is going to work with the new MDS. So first of all, what everyone is talking about is Section G being eliminated. We knew this was going to happen. It was delayed a little bit because of COVID, but we knew this was definitely something that CMS had on their radar. So Section G totally eliminated. Providers are wondering how to shift from the nurse aides documenting the late loss ADLs to using Section GG. As I talked about earlier, we've been doing Section GG for years now, and we still don't have it right. So there's going to be a lot of education required of our staff. We're going to have to look at our policies. We're going to have to look at cause and how things are generated as far as what care plans we're going to consider active for the resident. For you that are in case mix states, not to complicate things by talking about Medicaid reimbursement, since we have our hands full today talking about Medicare reimbursement. However, one state in particular I am aware of has already issued a memo that they're going to PDPM for their payment model, leaving RUGs behind, of course. So I would expect to see more of that. I would expect to see maybe some facilities or some states will choose optional state assessments to generate a RUG. But overall, Section G is gone, eliminated. So we need to start training now and thinking about how we're going to handle that. Section O, special treatments, procedures, and programs. You're going to see your first 3 Medicare days, you're going to be coding those special treatments such as oxygen, chemotherapy, etc., radiation. You're going to be coding those in respect to the first 3 days of the stay. Then you have your existing column, the last 14 days while a resident, and then you're going to see a discharge column, which will go to the last 3 Medicare days. We will no longer code while not a resident for these special treatments, procedures, and programs. The pain interview, there has been a question added on the effect of therapy related to pain. There are additional SNF QRPs, and this is going to be about, one of them in particular is going to be transferring health information to the patient upon discharge to the next provider. So, for example, if they go to home health or to an assisted living, what was the transfer of the health information so there was continuity across the spectrums of care? A shortened PHQ-9 interview. So we're going to go from a PHQ to a PHQ-2 to 9. And then we're going to see that after the first 2 questions, you can skip the others if the coding requirements are met. Section K changes. They added a column to capture the first 3 days and the last 3 days. So these are your nutritional interventions for the resident, nutritional and nutritional status questions. So we are kind of winding down to the end. We've talked about the missed opportunities. We've given some examples of exactly how much money missed opportunities are costing facility. With just a few examples there, we see that it's very significant. So I want to talk to leadership on the call first while we wrap up. So making it a priority to hire good people in your facility, I know is at the top of your to-do list, and you're looking at all kinds of ways to think outside the box. Contracting with people versus using agency staffing is just one I can think of off the top of my head. But I'm going to talk to you specifically about your MDS coordinators and how to support them. So as the manager of Polaris Group's outsourced remote MDS program, I have talked to, hundreds of MDS coordinators over the past year and a half while recruiting for that position, for positions within our program. And I want to share with you that one of the questions I ask is, what is making you want to leave your current position? And the applicant said to me, well, lots of things, but I'll tell you the straw that broke the camel's back for me and made me decide to leave the facility that I've been in for years is my administrator and I were talking, and I was expressing to him that I was feeling very overwhelmed, very behind. I was really struggling, really stressed out because I'd been working the floor. We had staffing issues. I knew I needed to work the floor, but I could not keep up with my MDS. And my administrator said to me, I don't understand what the problem is. You go in your office, you sit in front of a computer, and you click some boxes. Now, let that sink in for a minute. So she didn't receive the support. She wasn't validated as an important part of the team. I know the stress, and I can only imagine the decisions that you folks in leadership have to make. But this MDS coordinator was not supported. If you learned nothing from me today, support your MDS coordinators. Support them, provide them the education, provide the rest of your staff. It'll make the MDS coordinator's life so much easier if the rest of the staff can buckle down and understand the documentation requirements. And by the rest of the staff, I mean everybody from social services on down to your CNAs and your frontline staff. Hold yourself and hold your team and yourself. Again, speaking to leadership. Ask the questions. Hold yourself and your team accountable. When your rates fall, question why. Was it because of the type of residents we admitted over the last month or quarter or whatever you're looking at? Or is it a lack of education? Or is it because we're not taking advantage of our MDS coordinator and her knowledge base and doing things like setting the ARD early because she's too overwhelmed? Look at getting a second person or maybe a PRN person. Look at outsourcing for a second person. Or if you're without an MDS coordinator, before you pull someone off of cart and say, you've done a great job out here taking care of residents, so we're going to promote you and make you the MDS coordinator, have a plan in place to provide them the education, the mentoring, and the oversight. And finally, when you need help, reach out. We're there to help you. Get expert input and guidance. Polaris Group has been in business over 35 years. Some of the things we do is Medicare consulting. We talked about that all day today during our time together. Clinical compliance. We also offer mock surveys, infection control, focused mocks, AL mocks, lots of things on the clinical compliance end that we do. Offsite MDS coordinators and interim staffing for MDS coordinators. So just to clarify there, we have a program where we actually become the MDS coordinator remotely working as part of the facility team. And then we also have interim MDS coordinators. So if you need somebody to cover while someone's off for an extended time period, reach out to us for interim staffing. If you want a full-time long-range solution, off-site, outsourced MDS coordinators through Polaris Group may be something you want to discuss. So one more slide, and then I'm going to hand it back to Kim. One of the things that we find when we do PDPM accuracy, Medicare accuracy audits, we come in or we do the audit remotely, and we find that everybody gets excited. The MDS coordinators typically are really happy to be learning and are motivated. I'm going to change the way I'm doing things. I, appreciate the guidance, the administrators on board, and then we walk away or virtually walk away, and the facility gets back to business as usual the next day, not because they want to, because there's all those fires again. And the focus becomes what we have to do today rather than putting a plan in place to make improvements for next week, next month, ongoing. So we came up with a plan to provide kind of a more structured opportunity to help facilities with Medicare accuracy and compliance. So just a quick overview, we do either a PDPM audit or a more comprehensive Medicare assessment. Then we provide a facility training, and we tailor the training to what the facility had a problem with. So we don't just go to our toolbox and pull out a slideshow that we've developed long ago in the past. We actually build a training that's specific to your facility. And then we do monthly MDS audits, and we would certainly be able to do those off-site remotely. So that's our Polaris Edge related to Medicare accuracy. And then we also have one for clinical compliance, which has to do with, starting with a mock survey, then again, tailoring the training to the facility's problem areas, and then monthly chart audits thereafter. So please reach out to us. You can contact us at Polaris Group, www.polaris-group.com. If you have a specific question for me, I'm providing my email address, and I look forward to hearing from you. Kim?
I'm here, Wendy. Great presentation. You packed a lot in and got us to the 51-minute mark, so you did leave us a good amount of time for a few questions. So I'm going to jump right in. There's a quick and easy one here. You referred a few moments ago to a state going to its own version of PDPM for the Medicaid payments. Are you willing to say what state that is?
Yes. Now, I will admit that I have been really busy lately, so I haven't verified. I did see it on the MDS Facebook page, so got to verify that. But yes, it was the state of Tennessee had issued a memo laying out their plan for transitioning to PDPM.
Okay. And as you said, I don't think there'll be
just hearsay.
Say again?
I said, so just hearsay, make sure you dig in and don't take that as a fact. Again, I heard it on Facebook. So.
All right, fair enough. So I think, you gave so many different points of entry here and so many different areas where people can focus on. It could be a lot to digest if people, obviously in their facilities, everybody is so busy these days. Where's a good place to start to find those opportunities that may be missed?
Well, I like to use the term a roadmap. You don't get in the car and just start driving. We used to have maps. Now we have our virtual maps or our electronic maps. You have to have a roadmap. And you don't know how to get to where you're going unless you put in your current location. So you have to start with, where are you now? What is your MDS coordinator's skill set? How well do they know PDPM? How well do they know Medicare? We've talked a lot about PDPM reimbursement today, but something as simple as not having a cert properly signed, filled out on the chart can, cost you all of the money that we talked about today gaining through proper reimbursement. So assessing your Medicare, the entire program and the PDPM component of that program and how your reimbursement is going. So the first thing is do an audit. If you have someone at the regional level that can do that, that's great. If you don't, we are definitely equipped to come in and give you a baseline of where you are with Medicare and PDPM reimbursement. And from there, as I've said dozens of times over the last hour, education and oversight.
Okay, and here's a question that I think was specific to Section GG, and I think this happens a lot. If you have different disciplines documenting different needs or situations, how do you proceed? So here's the question. If nursing, therapy, and CNA documentation all differ, typically we have a practice to pick a diagnosis or a code in between. It might not be documented, but if dependent coding by CNA documentation and supervision level for others, should we choose dependent?
Well, it goes to the usual. And I want to hone in on the fact that you have 3 different disciplines. You have therapy, nursing, and CNAs. If that's the facility policy, but we have found that just clutters things up because you have so many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. So by all means, continue what you're doing if that's the facility policy, but consider the usual performance of Section GG code. That's your instructions. It's not the most. It's not a specific number like with Section G where you have 3 incidences and that's what you code to. So it's the usual performance. And what we recommend is therapy and nursing discuss this. They can do it during their Medicare meeting. They can do it, over the phone, at lunch, whatever. But they need to discuss and they need to determine what's really the usual performance. When we look at therapy, they usually come in on the day of admission. The resident is tired. They've been through sitting in the hospital waiting for hours. And what happens there is they may not perform at their best. With the subsequent days of the 3-day look back, they may do things differently than what they did for therapy. So coordinating, looking at the documentation, collaborating, and then the key here is if you code, for example, if you coded what therapy said, but you have this documentation in the record of what nursing said the usual performance was, you have to have a note somewhere to clarify. This is why we chose to code in the way that we did. So, for example, my therapy documentation reflects the resident requires less assistance. Once the resident returns to the nursing unit, they're fatigued from therapy and they require more assistance on the nursing unit, which is the usual performance for the resident, and that justifies the documentation or the coding in that one note that you can provide, a kind of a summary wrap-up note.
Okay.
Does that help?
That does. And I want to say we have quite a few questions where people are asking about specific codes, and I'm not going to ask all those questions right now. I think there would be caveats with many of them. So what I would say to anyone who doesn't have their question answered right now is that you may receive an answer by email after this webinar. So Polaris, I'm sure, will be happy to reach out with you on that. We do have time for 2 more quick questions, though, Wendy. Again, maybe you can read between the lines here and help me interpret this, but I think this is a question of choosing 2 different codes or categories. The way it's phrased is balancing IV fluids payment with 5 days of therapy. Do you understand what they're asking?
Yes, I do. Okay, so that is something I do hear a lot. I will hear the answer to my question, why are you setting the ARD for day 7 or day 8? It's to get therapy. Your therapy no longer drives reimbursement. We're not any longer under the RUGS payment model. So I think people think I have to have 5 days of therapy within the look back period, but it's 5 days of therapy per week is your skilled service. So it doesn't necessarily, your MDS does not necessarily have to reflect 5 days of therapy as long as the record as a whole reflects I am meeting the requirements for skilled service. Necessary, appropriate, skilled therapy is my skilled service. For that situation, the entire record will reflect the skilled services. The MDS does not have to be coded with 5 days of therapy. Does that help? Am I being clear there, Kim?
Well, I didn't understand the question because this is not my specialty, so I'm hoping that it did for the audience.
Okay.
Thank you, Wendy.
Well,
so
whomever asked that
question, I want to give time, Wendy, because we have 1 minute left, so I want to get to this last question. I don't mean to cut you off, but I wanted to give you a chance to talk again about the idea of MDS assessment remotely. How does that work? Can you give us kind of the 30-second breakdown on that?
Yes, I can. So in a nutshell, remote MDS is possible. It works. It is challenging, but it does work. It is a group effort. An MDS coordinator sitting in her office 100 miles away from the facility cannot do it unless she becomes part of the team and the team supports her. It is challenging. It is not easy, but it is a solution that we can look to, because as I've talked about for the last hour, the state that we're in right now, which is the better choice, having an MDS coordinator work remotely at home, doing your MDSs, driving your team, getting you the proper reimbursement, or pulling somebody off the cart that doesn't know anything about MDS. They're there, they're a body, but they're not doing the job because they don't know how to do the job.
Yeah, that's certainly the reality of the situation right now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Wendy, thank you for that answer and for this whole presentation. It was terrific. I want to remind folks, it looks like our slide is not loading, so maybe you want to jot this down. If you want to rewatch this or share it with somebody to view on demand, it is at www.mcknights.com/110322 webinar. Of course, I want to thank Wendy Strain again, and also Polaris for sponsoring today's session. And thank you to our listeners. You asked a bunch of great questions. Like I said, hopefully we'll be able to get those responses to you. Please see the handouts tab too for the documents today. And be sure to come back for future McKnights webinars listed under our events tab at mcknights.com. Once again, thank you all for tuning in. This is Kim Marcellus for McKnights. Have a great afternoon.